Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our State of the Union discussion brought to you by the SF Bay Area Network and the DC Politics and Policy Network. My name is Nicole Getz, and I graduated from Oxford College in 2013 and Emory College in 2014 with a degree in International Studies. I currently serve as a co-vice president of Volunteerism and Philanthropy for the San Francisco Bay Area Network, but clearly, policy and politics is still very close to my heart. Anyway, I'm so proud to serve on this board, working with my fellow volunteers to connect alumni to the university and each other. Together, we build traditions, foster student and alumni leadership, and work to serve the diverse needs of our community. Events like these are a great showcase of the partnership between Emory Networks, the Alumni Association, and the university. We're working to develop a dedicated and dynamic global alumni community whose members are committed to each other and devoted to Emory's mission to create, preserve, teach, and apply knowledge in the service of humanity and invested in its students and its future. And what kind of board member would I be if I didn't share a little bit about the SF Bay Area Network? Our network is home to over 3,000 Emory alumni, in addition to hundreds of current students, parents, and friends of Emory. In fact, we'd love to see you at our West Coast Board Virtual Happy Hour on February 17th, where we can share ideas, get to know one another, and relax. And of course, you can always keep up to date with us by following us on our Instagram page at Emory Alumni SF. We not only share cute pictures of dogs, but also feature upcoming events and local alumni. And if you're interested in becoming involved with or have any questions about broader Emory networks or other alumni volunteer opportunities, you can reach out via email at regionalnetworks@emory.edu. Again, that's regionalnetworks@emory.edu. And before we begin, I'd like to cover some brief basics on today's webinar. The chat feature is disabled for this program, but please feel free to drop a question in the Q&A function. We will try our best to get to all questions. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded, and it will be posted for viewing on the Emory Collective. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Josh Jackson, who is the Vice President of the Emory DC and Politics and Policy Network. Josh?
Thanks, Nicole. I'm glad to be here. My name is Josh Jackson, and I'm a graduate of the Emory Law School. My role is basically an alumni volunteer with the DC network, specifically the new Politics and Policy Network. As the network name suggests, myself with numerous alumni and volunteers are in the nation's capital, and we have recently launched this network to better serve and connect alumni working in the federal government across various agencies and on the front line of advocacy and policy work. Our network consists of about 6,500 alumni in the DC area. We work with 13 other networks in the region, and the board has about 7 committees to engage our local community in unique and meaningful ways across the entire network and the Alumni Association. I'm honored to moderate today's webinar and would like to introduce Gonzalo Maturino, who joined the Goizeta Business School in 2015. And I believe that's right. And his PhD is in finance at the University of Texas at Austin, McCombs School of Business, right? And your primary research focuses on corporate finance, household finance, real estate finance, and conflicts of interest, which I'm very interested to hear more about in terms of the publications that you've done across the Journal of Financial Economics, Review of Financial Studies, Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, and Management Sciences. You are also an award winner of the Michael J. Brennan Award for Best Paper and Review of Financial Studies in 2017, and you are a Rising Scholar Award for Best Paper of the Young Researcher in Review of Financial Studies in 2020. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I'd like to open our discussion. First, let's hear your thoughts a little bit on your work. Since this is State of the Union, let's just dive right in with the Biden's first State of the Union. And really, what are what are you thinking in terms of later this month or sometime soon on what he's going to start out with?
Yeah, so well, first of all, thanks for the introduction, Josh. I'm happy to be here. This is the first time I get asked a question that is related to politics. So I'm going to keep it from the economic and finance angle. But yeah, it's interesting. I think this is the one year I would basically dare to bet what the State of the Union is going to discuss. And I think obviously it's going to focus a lot on COVID and the next stimulus package, right? So I think important topics that are typically addressed, such as employment, for example, are going likely to be discussed in the context of the pandemic. Also, in addition, I think based on the executive orders that the president has signed so far, I would also expect him to discuss government plans with regards to climate change, Medicaid, immigration. What else? So I think also another issue that I would think President Biden will address more generally is the issue of inequality. That seems to concern him and his party a lot, right? So so I think that's going to definitely be part of what sets the tone. Um, Also, I think that more generally, the recent political environment, right, and the fact that COVID became a political issue for many people, I think has translated into a lot of division. So I would expect the president also to address this. And I think the State of the Union will provide the president with an opportunity to hopefully make all Americans understand that we're going through extremely difficult times, right, and that we all need to do our part to bring the pandemic and all the problems associated with it, right, economic problems, for example, to an end as soon as possible. I think there's a lot of skepticism from some people with regards to masks, vaccine, science more generally, right? And I think the speech would be a good opportunity also for the president to address these issues and be clear in terms of what is his vision for the path that the country will follow to leave COVID behind.
Great. So let's dive right in because your background, I think I said financial studies 15 times in your introduction. So let's dive right into the 2008 2009 State of the Union, right? Right after the is it would it be more important to look before or after? And I think in this case, it'd be after the collapse. Um, then and now we have the pandemic. Uh, Now we're going into almost like a new collapse, and but a different, relatively the same sort of financials. Um, what does that look like to you?
Yes, so yeah, most of my research actually it's related to the 2008 financial crisis, right? So I think the nature of both crises, like you mentioned, it's very different, right? First, because of its origin, right? So the COVID crisis is different from the typical economic crisis that occurs as part of, let's say, the business cycle and overheating of the economy, or at least part of the economy overheating, right? For example, when the financial crisis of 2008 originated due to a housing bubble, and that this housing bubble was facilitated by excess credit, right, a deterioration of lending standards more generally, right? In this case, the COVID crisis originated from the spreading of the virus, right? Now, obviously, what triggered the economic situation that we're in was the fact that we needed to have lockdowns at some point, right, to restrain the virus, right? And we haven't been able to conduct business as usual. But why do I mention this? Because then uh, I believe you can pass all the stimulus plans that you want, right? But in the end, what you really need to tackle is the source of the problem, which is the spreading of the virus in this case. So when you think, for example, when you compare government interventions, right? In the financial crisis, first, the size of the stimulus was much smaller. The stimulus is much larger now. So just to provide some context and remind people, right? So TARP, which was the salvage the aid program that was conducted at the time, right, was originally authorized to spend 700 billion, right? But they ended up spending somewhere around 475 billion. So far, I think the last time I checked, there were, and I might have these numbers slightly off, right? So far, I think there's been 2.6 trillion that have been directly allocated to COVID relief, and this doesn't count tax breaks, right, and other less direct ways of providing relief, right? And the administration is now pushing for an additional 1.9 trillion stimulus, right? So the amounts are completely different. The second thing that I think is important to highlight is that the use of the funds is also quite different. So a large portion of TARP funds were used to purchase equity on financial institutions. So remember this idea of tackling the source of the problem, right? So the problem and the financial crisis was with the banks, right? So TARP basically purchased equity in a lot of these financial institutions that were distressed, and the idea was to stabilize the source of the problem, right? Now that investment actually panned out, and estimates say that TARP earned about $11 billion for taxpayers. Now, the nature of the COVID stimulus is very different in the sense that most of the money has gone directly to subsidize household consumption, businesses, right? The vaccines, trying to prevent the spreading of the virus. And we probably haven't spent enough in this last category, right? But my point is that this is not money that we're going to recover. It's just going to add to the national debt. And one last number, right, that I think might be useful. Now the national debt is around, I think, around 130% of GDP, and that's huge, right? And I think it hasn't been seen since World War II. So as long as investors continue to have faith in the US, right, it's probably, you can argue, it's not a big issue, right? But it's not clear when markets will determine that maybe the US has too much debt, right? There's also this issue that the Fed has been printing money to buy treasuries, right? The question is this going to create inflation or not, right? It didn't during the last financial crisis, but now the magnitudes are a little bit different, right? So all this money flowing into the economy maybe also explains things such as the performance of the stock market, right? That which is pretty difficult to justify.
Right. So in this regard, we have been thinking about the amount of debt. Now, in terms of the interest rates, if we think about the housing crisis, right? In that case, we're going into this prolonged low interest rate. Do you think that's going to lead into another housing bubble, or can we avoid that? Now, my first thought is that in terms of house, I think it's really a seller's market. I think the price of homes just skyrocketed, and everyone's staying in their home with these low interest rates. But what do you think?
So I think this situation is a little bit different. So it's true that house prices have bounced back and they're pretty high, right? But one thing I think played a big role during the financial crisis was this private securitization, right? So remember, there were these securities structured by banks, which were basically packaging mortgages, right? Slicing those into securities and selling them to investors, right? So these are different from the mortgage-backed securities that you have that are guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, right? So this market basically disappeared. At the time, that market created a lot of misaligned incentives for the different participants of the markets, right? So think about the lenders. Lenders were issuing loans. They didn't have really too much incentive to screen borrowers because they were selling in a week, right? The loan was not going to be in their balance sheet, right? So that created incentives for them not to check. Then credit rating agencies were rating everything AAA, right? Banks were doing good business. Everyone was kind of like euphoric, right? And that basically facilitated a lot of excess credit that arguably shouldn't have gone to borrowers, right? Which basically increased demand for housing and pushed house prices up. Now, it's a little bit different now. Now, some people are arguing that now you are getting something similar with FHA loans, right?
Right.
But I think that the nature is still a little bit different. Now, rates are low. It's true that a lot of people, I think, are going to take advantage of these rates and try to maybe refinance, right, and maybe purchase more houses, right? But there's also a lot of people that are struggling financially, so it's not that clear whether house prices are going to continue to go up, right? Now, I wouldn't speculate on house prices because I tend to get price predictions wrong, right? So
Yeah. I think I guess we won't go down that path because I think we're always I'm getting house predictions wrong or pricing predictions. Can we talk? And I think this kind of leads nicely into the individual COVID relief, right? How are we going to pay for housing, right? You had talked about the 2.6 trillion already spent. Now we're looking to spend, I think, 109 trillion maybe in Biden's plan. And so him trying to individually support the American people, the individual pricing, um, I think between $1,000 to $1,400. Is that right for per individual?
yes, so with regards to that, I think that the key issue is targeting the aid correctly, right? So when you think, and that cannot only operate in isolation, and I'll come back to the aid to individuals in a second, right? But roughly you can split the nature of the provisions in the aid in two categories, right? The first category consists on directly aiding households and businesses, right? With checks. They have also talked about the unemployment insurance extension, right? The supplement, sorry. They have even talked about increases in minimum wage, right? I'm not going to go there because I think it's very debatable whether that's a good idea or not, right? Eviction, extend eviction and foreclosure moratoriums, right? So these are all provisions and aid packages addressing households directly, right? The second group consists on trying to accelerate vaccination, right, and increase testing and controlling the pandemic. I think that's key actually, and everything else that you do is kind of trying to get enough time so that you can hopefully avoid a bankruptcy, right, and survive until we reach herd immunity. Now, going back to to this plan, right? So we were talking about the magnitudes, right? And this is an unprecedented amount of money that the government is planning to spend. So it's very important in my view, and this has been the discussion, right? On the opposition side, it needs to be well targeted, right? It needs to go to people that are going to use the money for food, right? To pay rent, to pay for the hospital, right? Things that are really necessary. You don't want people to go, let's say, and buy a TV
Mhm.
with the money. So that's very important. And it's not trivial to target the money, right? So to give you an example on the business domain, right? So we had this first round of the Paycheck Protection Program, right, that went to businesses. There's some research by some of my colleagues, some colleagues at Chicago, right, that shows actually that the effectiveness of this first round of PPP was very limited, or at least was very modest for the amounts invested, right? So remember that the idea of this program was to help firms with payroll. But what they show with very detailed data, right, is that many firms actually spent the money on other things or simply decided to save. So they actually didn't need the money, but they thought, okay, maybe we're going to need the money in the future because there's a lot of uncertainty now, right?
Right.
So you don't want to actually be subsidizing uh, homeowners, right, or individuals, right, that actually don't need the help, because you can actually put the money at work for very important things such as increased vaccination, right, in terms
Right.
of speed and things that are directly going to tackle the origin of the crisis. So yes, to sum up, I think you need to target well. There's one argument also to help individuals beyond just help them survive, right? That is that this might generate positive externalities in the sense of preventing the spread of the virus too, right? So think about those homeowners that are really distressed, right? They're in a risk of becoming homeless, right? Once you become homeless, okay, this is really going to increase the likelihood that you're spreading the virus, or that you become afflicted by the virus and end up in a bad situation, right? So you can make the argument actually for some sort of system of transfers from people that are not financially affected by COVID to those that are, and I think that's what essentially the government is doing. But yeah, the risk of repeating myself many times, right? I think targeting the aid is the key, and it requires people being responsible on how they spend the money. Right now, you cannot count on that, right? If people get offered money, they're going to take it, right? So I think that's why the government ultimately needs to figure out a way to target this to people that really need it.
So this is great because I think about the targeting, right? We originally said that if we do the payroll protection, the PPP loan program, right, and trying to keep people employed, there was also this large influx of unemployment checks, right? And so there's these competing interests, right? Do I get my job back or do I stay unemployed? And if you don't think that the targeting, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but if you don't think that just giving the check is the best way, do you think it would be better to put money into state and local governments that could then put more back into unemployment or healthcare services, or increasing the amount of COVID vaccines? Would that be a better use?
So I think there's an argument to be made that, okay, yeah, you need some degree of checks going to individuals, right? But you also need everything that you just mentioned, right? And that might allow you to actually target better the people that are in need, right? People that actually showed at the hospital, right? So that they don't have these huge bills that you hear sometimes that people end up after becoming seriously infected with COVID, right? Yeah, like local organizations maybe directing money in neighborhoods that are distressed in ways that are efficient in order to provide relief to people, right? But I'm not saying that you shouldn't send the checks, right? It's just that you need to be very careful, and it's not obvious to me how you do that, right? So, for example, going back, I'm more familiar with this PPP program, right? So, but I think the same logic applies, right? When you think about how they did the PPP, the first round for businesses, right? You hear a lot of anecdotal evidence of hedge funds getting huge loans, right?
Right.
So you run into this issue that the most financially sophisticated managers, right, are most likely going to beat the others that need the help, right, because they're less sophisticated into applying to these loans, right? So they have tried to correct this in the second rounds of PPP, for example, by giving the money first to community banks, which tend to deal with small businesses, right, instead of large banks that deal with larger businesses, right? So that hopefully small businesses get served first, right? And they're also trying to, they cap the maximum size of the loans, right? They have been thinking about how to target more. Now, I think they have thought more on how to target business loans than loans to individuals. It seems to me that as long as you're under a certain cutoff, they were suggesting 120K, right? You are eligible to getting some sort of relief, but the situations among people, right, with that sort of income, right, varies tremendously, right?
Yeah, and I think this leads right into your open letter to Congress, with like 250 close to leading economists that, near the start of COVID, right? That bailout was the title, bailout people before large corporations. So with the change of the administration and this upcoming speech, what has changed, if anything, that this signing this letter, and now we are going into an administration that hopefully is for the people, right? How would you like the president, like what is something that he should say that is going to really change the landscape and push things to regarding small business support or individuals?
Okay. Yeah. So I think there's well-founded concern more generally that this crisis is going to increase inequality, right? For all these issues, like I was mentioning earlier, right? If you're a hedge fund manager, very sophisticated, you understand how to apply very quickly, and you're the first one in line to get your loan, right? Uh, so so it's very easy to get tempted, right, and start, I wouldn't say wasting is the right word, but directing resources in an inefficient way, right? So this letter was an initiative from a faculty at Stanford, actually, who thought that, okay, like we're seeing all this discussion about bailing out large corporations, like giving money to airlines, right? Whereas you had all these small businesses struggling. And the point of the letter was that ultimately, when you bail out a large corporation, you're subsidizing investors, right? Shareholders in that corporation. It's not that you're really aiding workers directly. There's more efficient ways to get to those workers, right? Also, most of the employment in the US is basically related to small businesses, right? So, it feels a little bit unfair, right? Because if you believe in capitalism, right, and markets, right, these shareholders actually took a risk, invested in these companies, profited from the upside in prices, right, and returns during the expansion, right? And now, yeah, they were hit by like a almost like a random shock, right, that no one expected, which is negative, right? But that's unfortunate, but that's part of the risk when you invest in stocks, right? So you could make an argument, yeah, that's why we have bankruptcy for, right? Bankruptcy doesn't mean liquidation. You can run an airline, to give that example, right? For many years in like in a regime of bankruptcy, right? And then you can focus, right, on using that money to actually aid small businesses, which basically is going to be a more direct way to get to individuals that are distressed and losing their jobs. Remember that most of the unemployment spike that we saw, right? We saw actually unemployment peak up to 15% in April of last year, right? That's mostly related to the services industry, right?
Mhm.
Those are all small businesses, or only most of them are, it's never all, right? But most of them are small businesses. So, but also now the unemployment, and I'm drifting apart from the question a little bit. Now unemployment is 6.7%. So the situation doesn't seem to be that severe. But anyways, going back to the topic of the letter, the spirit was, okay, shareholders, they're taking a risk, right? They should basically also take the downside if they're taking the upside. Once you file for bankruptcy, other shareholders are going to take over eventually, right? But you should focus on the small businesses. That was the spirit of the letter. I don't know whether the administration is going to take that into consideration. I think they would, essentially because they're worried about this issue of inequality more generally that I discussed before. I don't know
Yeah,
if
okay. No, this is good. This is good because you had mentioned the unemployment's around 6%, right? So it's dropped um, quite a bit, right? So if COVID is top of mind, then he shouldn't. But at the same time, he wants to keep people safe, right, and potentially at home. But he doesn't want to wreck the economy by saying stay at home, right? You don't expect him to say that, or do you?
No, so I think the lockdown was pretty costly.
Hmm.
And when you think about the lockdown, I think it was justified in the sense that we knew very little about the virus at that point, right? So we weren't sure about its mortality, right? How fast it spread. There was a lot of uncertainty, right? there wasn't testing. You didn't have not even like started a plan of producing a vaccine, right? So I think it made sense to actually lock down the economy and put all the resources to work on trying to ramp up testing and get prepared, right? And that took a month,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that was pretty costly. And that's when you saw 15% unemployment, right? Which is something that starts affecting the welfare of people pretty fast, right? Now I wouldn't go back to that, right? I would do everything that you can to avoid that. Now, the problem is that for that, you need to avoid the healthcare system from collapsing, right? The moment that the healthcare system starts collapsing, right, then mortality rate increases, panic increases more generally. People that are following the news, although it seems that like
Yeah.
a big fraction of the population don't read the news too much, right? But then you are going to end up in your home voluntarily, right? No one's going to force you, right? And if
Right.
and if you don't, right? The problem is that if you have a heart attack, then you die because there's no one to take care of you at the hospital. So that's when you think about closing the economy a little bit more, right? And that's what you saw in California, right? That they started pushing these rules, right? Of that start creating frictions in the economy in order to protect the hospitals. But so I wouldn't expect them to do that, right? But ultimately, like I said, right, there was a recovery in employment that was quite impressive. Actually, if you think going from 15% unemployment to 6.7 last time I checked, right? So that's a lot. When you think about what's the natural rate of unemployment in the US, yeah, we were in 3 point something before COVID, but a lot of people argue that that was like almost like overemployment, right? So, but if you think of a 4% being healthy, yeah, I think the only way of recovering in the end, this 2.7% that we're still missing, right, will be once we reach herd immunity, right? And people can actually do business as usual.
Right. Well, I think, and maybe this, I don't know where this fits exactly, but maybe it does in terms of, targeting certain areas of the economy. So Biden put out the executive orders to extend the pause on student loans, I think until October in terms of payments and interest, and then the nationwide restrictions on it, evictions and foreclosures. So I mean, expand a little bit more. Maybe, do we see that his speech really is going to relate to housing and real estate? Or is it, I mean, for those that are from the Silicon Valley area on this call, are we going to see more sort of tech startups culture, people working from home? Like, is that going to start shifting that way due to COVID?
So yeah, I think they would probably touch on all these topics, right? And Democrats in general are pushing this idea, for example, not only of extending the pause on student loans, right, but actually forgiving student debt, right? So I think they might actually bring all this discussion back in the State of the Union. Now, like my opinion here is it's thinking about these issues is pretty tricky, right? So let me start by talking about the student loans first, and then I'll go to the suspension of foreclosures.
Careful how you answer that though, because I think there are a lot of students on the call.
Yeah, I know, it's tricky, but there are students that are probably going to do just fine.
Agreed.
I'm kind of like hinting my way of thinking about it already. Uh, so again, with student loans, the issue is how you target the aid, right? So individuals with federal student loans like are likely of higher income compared to the general population, right? So because like these loans, the recipients of these loans went to either for-profit colleges or large universities, right? These are people that have degrees, right, and make more than the average household in general, right? So there's also the issue of that maybe this is not only not the best way of targeting the aid, right? But First, it opens the door for loan forgiveness, which I think is something very complicated, right? We can debate whether it's a good thing or not, but each time you think about forgiving debt, right, you start generating moral hazard, right, and incentives to default. Think about the differences between a house, like a mortgage, right, and student loans, right? If I default on the house, they're going to take my house away. If I default in the student loan, right, no one can take away what I learned, right? So it's an intangible. So it's very different how you might respond the moment you know that there's a chance for your loan to be forgiven, right? You might strategically default and say, you know what, like I just can't make it, and try to get it forgiven, right? So, but maybe we shouldn't focus about that because they're not talking exactly about that yet, right? But going back to the question, right? When you think about uh, extending, pausing these student loan payments, right? That's benefiting people that typically are of higher income, I think at least. Now, the suspension of foreclosures a little bit, it's similar and different in one dimension. So it's similar to the student loans in the sense that people with larger mortgages, right, also tend to have higher income, right? And
Right.
also that not all the mortgages are guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is the extensions, right, relate to those type of loans, right? But now there's an additional complexity when you're thinking about foreclosures, which is that actually they generate negative spillover effects to the prices of neighboring properties. So that's potentially very damaging to neighborhoods, right? So the moment you start having waves of foreclosures in a neighborhood, then prices go down, right? Because these properties tend to be sold at discounts, roughly of 30%. That's the estimation of the discount. And that's because either they're not well maintained, right? So they lose a lot of value. They're more likely to be vandalized, right? And also there's this urgency on the sale, right? So each time you liquidate something with urgency, uh, prices go down, right? So once that happens, then what happens if you see that your house, the house across the street, which is very similar to yours, just went at, let's say, 30% less than what you thought it was worth, right? You start getting incentivized, right, to maybe default if you have a higher loan, right? So it becomes very complicated once you have these fire sales in a neighborhood. So you might think of the extension on foreclosures, right? These foreclosure moratoriums, right?
Yeah.
Are different in the sense that they might prevent these negative spillover effects of foreclosures. Now, they're also thinking about extending uh, rent, right?
Right.
That's tricky again, right? Because you typically think that these landlords are big corporations, but that's roughly half of the rental properties. Many of the properties are actually individuals that have one, two properties at most, right? So once they don't receive the rent payments, they cannot pay for the mortgages, right? And they start becoming distressed. And it's not really their fault, for example, if their renter, right, lost the job. So it's very debatable when you're thinking about these issues.
Okay, great. Let's. This is all fascinating around the financial piece of this. Um, I'd like to jump to climate change, right? So if and maybe we should have said this earlier, we could probably and we said this multiple times in terms of predicting the larger topics, right? Um, and this is probably the year that you could predict the most with COVID, the economy, and climate change. So, in terms of climate change, President Biden signed a recent executive order. Um, or no, did he sign an executive order? I don't think he did. Did he? He just talked about it's a policy of climate change and shifting from the prior administration by going back into the Paris Climate Accord. So I think this is going to be a main issue. And given the executive orders he did sign, maybe this is a thought on what he's going to sign next, maybe.
Yes, so I think so I think he might present an ambitious agenda in terms of climate change. This is obviously not my topic in terms of research and everything, but I was listening to, for example, this podcast of the New York Times recently. They were talking about climate change. It was the Daily, I think. I'm doing advertising for free now, I realize. Anyways, they don't pay me, by the way. No, so I thought the perspective that they had there was pretty interesting in the sense that they mentioned, okay, Obama had an ambitious agenda. It seems that Biden, based on the campaign, right, it's even more ambitious, right? And it might actually move forward a little bit easier now, in the sense that you'll see how you have seen how many of the large corporations, right, car manufacturers have actually announced. GM was, I think, recently announcing that they're planning to go all electric, right, in the future, right? So they were discussing there, if I remember the numbers correctly, that 1/3 of the emissions, right, of carbon dioxide are done by cars, right?
Right.
When Obama's administration was pushing these policies, right? Car manufacturers were not ready to do this, right? So the moment Trump got into office, they started pushing for a repeal of all these plans, right? And they were successful. Now, so that justify a lot of in my opinion, I think a lot of the decisions that were made in the last administration. Now, it seems now that these car manufacturers are open to this, right? And they're already investing to do this transition. Right? So it might be doable. And I think they were speculating that maybe by 2035, if I got the numbers correctly, most of the cars would be electric. Now they were also talking about oil wells, right, and the pollution that they generate. I'm not an expert there, right, but that seems that that was another component, and I think that he already signed some executive orders in order to increase regulation there, right, and
Right.
supervision of pollution, right. So that's one, and the other one, which is the most problematic. I don't know if he's going to address it, but it will be interesting to hear about it. Is power plants, right? So power plants pollute quite a bit, and yeah, no one's going to be willing to take a soar in energy prices, right? So I think that's the most conflicted one. So I'm not sure what he's going to come up with, but it seems like an important issue for the administration.
Yeah, I'll have one more plug, just in terms of podcasts for advertising, and then if you don't mind, we'll go to. We have three open questions in the Q&A. So Brian Deese, right, is part of his economic council, and he is a part of BlackRock, right? And he was on Freakonomics, their podcast, and talked about that they are looking at their $7 trillion portfolio. Climate change is one of the top things in which they're looking at in terms of investing. So I think there could be a lot in there.
Mm-hmm.
In which he's hearing from his advisors. So I think that's going to be an interesting piece on what we go to. You ready for some questions here? I think we have some here. What indicators of a bubble forming around Silicon Valley and the tech startup culture, or is it a data-driven market explosion which has defied typical 5-year business cycle, fluctuating since 2009, legitimate upward growth?
Okay, so that here's where we get close to investment advice, right?
So let's try and get like maybe 2 minutes
Yeah.
on this.
So yes, I'm like valuations seem high more generally, right? Even if you look at the tech sector, you think although valuation is not something I'm looking at on a daily basis, right? But you would also think that that's where a lot of the growth of the economy is going to come like over the next years, right? It's going to come from there, right? Like you see how machine learning essentially seems to be being applied for everything, right? I'm always impressed by Amazon, right? And all these new things they come up with. I'm going to deviate from a little bit, but you know that when I was in Chile, that's where I come from. The first time I bought a book online, I thought, okay, this company really is gonna take over the world. The only link that I didn't have at that time is that I could buy stock, right? So I missed that one. Yeah, yeah, but yeah, in terms of predictions, right? In terms of valuation, like who knows, right? Like I've been telling people that I think the stock market is it's too high, right? Like it's been like a few months now. There was like a small correction, but then it went back again. I just don't completely understand it. I think it's partly related to one of the other
Yeah.
questions, right? Which is monetary policy and rates being too low, and essentially the Fed buying assets, right? Even corporate debt sometimes, which is something that is very, for at least for me, it's difficult to completely justify, right? So I think it's like try to manipulate the base rates, right?
Hmm.
The base rates, right? But leave the spreads to the market. That's kind of like my view. But I think it might be related to something like that, like low rates, right? Cheap credit, cheap money, right? Allowing that also lowers the discount rates, right? Mechanically, so valuations become higher. I don't know if I answered the question, but these are tough questions, I think.
They are tough questions here. Let's go to the next one. How can we leverage COVID stimulus to create a pivot, revolution for the US economy long term, future of work, maybe?
Yeah, I think the future of work is one. Now, it's not obvious in which sectors, right, remote working is going to make you more productive. I actually have some work on this, but looking at the productivity of economists, right, and financial, sorry, finance faculty during the pandemic, it turns out that academics wrote more working papers during the lockdown months, right? So will be like I've been in my house, right, for the last 9 months, right? And there's an argument to be made that maybe I haven't been as productive because I have kids, but my colleagues that don't have kids, they have had a productivity boost, right? So they're churning out research. Now we cannot say anything about quality yet, right? And there's some caveats, but there's some reasons to believe that maybe technology is going to make uh, people more efficient in some areas. Now there's other areas where you really need the interaction, right? So that's not obvious. I think also the technology that has been developed for on vaccinations, for example, that's going to be huge, right? So I was reading recently that this new mRNA technology might be actually useful to tackle cancer, right? Or now you can use this technology to develop any vaccine. So people in the sciences, right? And I'm ignorant there, but I was reading about it, are claiming that basically we move forward decades, right, in terms of advancing these technologies. So once you think that people have better access to health, right, and we can solve like probably like future pandemics faster, right? Hopefully we
Right.
learn how to address those too. There's going to be some productivity gains more generally, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah. Last question, because these are good. Economically, um, how is nuclear power not the obvious solution to all things pollution, climate, jobs, etc.?
Yeah, that's you said it's tough because I don't know exactly what the cost of producing nuclear power, right? But I think how people think about nuclear power is, would you like a nuclear power plant next to your house, right? That's the question, right? So I think that's why it's complicated, right? It works fine until it doesn't, and you have an accident, right? And maybe you shouldn't worry too much about that, right? But I would be concerned, for example, in California, where you may have some earthquakes, right? To have power plants, right? I come from Chile, we have earthquakes all the time. Definitely, that's not the option there, right? So I think that's how people think about them, right? So politically, I think it's very complicated, like where you place it. That's
Yeah.
just one dimension, I know, but uh,
Okay, one more just came in. As people work from home, we'll go back to that. Brick and mortar buildings decrease. How big of an impact might that have on commercial real estate? And so this might be tied to Amazon buying up more warehouses,
yeah,
right?
yeah, definitely. So absolutely, I think that actually might change, right? So again, I don't like doing inference based on one observation, but the other day my wife told me, "Look, I'm never going to the supermarket again." We're using Instacart, right? I always fight not to go to the supermarket, so we got to this arrangement, not during the pandemic, more generally, right?
Right,
We got
right.
this arrangement that okay, I take the kids to school in the morning, but I don't go to the supermarket because I'm just so inefficient finding stuff, right? But going back to the question, I think that's huge, right? So people are using technology now for buying. I think I read a number, trying to remember, maybe 10,000 uh, uh, shopping malls, right?
Right.
Strip centers running into trouble because they didn't have enough revenue now, right? So
Hmm.
I think commercial real estate might be really affected. It's not obvious that it's going to bounce back even when the pandemic is over, because this has been long enough of a shock to affect habits, right? So they say a habit gets formed in how long. I think is if you're able to wake up in the morning and exercise for 3 weeks every day, you can continue doing it. Something like that, right? We've been locked down for like 10 months now, right? So people are used to using technology to buy. So I think that might change the commercial real estate landscape. Yeah.
Right. So personally, like anything like shocking, is there that he might address in the State of the Union in the last 2 minutes we have here?
So when you talk about personal views here, for me, I think something that I think he should address, right? And as a foreigner, right, it's something that it's in my mind is the division, right, that you see in the country, right? Political division now, like it seems it's very polarized. This pandemic thing became something political that for me it's something very difficult to understand, actually, because uh, I think in Latin America we have more of this collective mind
Mhm.
thinking, right? Which kind of help us internalize externalities a little bit more, right? But I think the problem is that because it became a political discussion, people took sides, right, independent of the evidence, right, and are not really cooperating to get the pandemic under control, and ultimately that hurts everyone, right? That hurts the economy, right? People that get sick, there's unnecessary death and losses. So I'm really looking forward to him trying to unite the country, right, and provide some guidelines, right, of what should we expect uh, looking forward, right? Guide people, right? Tell them, look, you need to wear the mask, right? You need to continue to wear the mask after you get vaccinated, right? Because one issue that I'm sure we're going to face is that once people get vaccinated, they might think, okay, now I don't need the mask, right? But it's not true, right? So how do you actually guide people? How do you direct information towards the people so that they make the informed decisions, right? Essentially what we were talking about, business loans, right? Give the information to small business owners, right? And help them to actually use the aid that is available because it's not uh, what they do all the time, right? So yeah, these guidelines, I don't know if that's going to be shocking, right? Maybe maybe this, I wouldn't find it as shocking, but it's what I'm looking forward personally beyond all the economic measures and COVID related stuff. Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
if I answered the question. And sometimes I feel I go to the tangents,
Oh
but
no, that was good. I mean, I think personally we all have different things that we're looking forward to, and I think in the past administration, they were able to make a lot of great comments around certain things, and then they make comments that one little comment changed the whole landscape politically and nationally. And so the Biden administration I think he'll use the State of the Union like it used to be, from what I'm hearing you say, and address some of these some of these issues. So
Yeah, no, to be clear, I'm saying there were some, like you said, some things that the prior administration did that maybe created the polarization, but they also did a lot of things like pretty well, right? When you think about actually developing a vaccine, and I think one of the things that they really did well was to subsidize the research and development associated to the vaccine, right? This is unprecedented. I think we tend to forget that in a year, right, it was never the case that you were able to come up with a vaccine. So this is a huge success, right? 95% efficacy for some of the vaccines, right? So they definitely did a lot of things right, but for some reason, like some division was created in the process. So
well, I think this is a good place to start so we don't get too political here. And
no, that's right.
so we're nearing the end of the hour, and I really want to thank you for all of your time and sharing your insights and expertise and experience and a perspective from an academic, but also from your native of Chile. So as noted earlier, we will have a recording available on the emorycollective.com website. And from there, I hope you'll continue to stay connected for all the Emory alum out there and those in the Emory community, whether you're a student or not. As Nicole mentioned at the start, our Emory Network and the Alumni Association are currently um, continuing to work through these virtual opportunities to stay connected, engaged, and informed. So there are a few things coming up that I just want to bring attention for the Emory community here is that we will be celebrating Black History Month with numerous events, including the next Emory Community Conversation on the construct of race and an upcoming conversation with alumni Candace Hollingsworth on the launch of our Black Party, hosted by the DC Caucus of Emory Black Alumni. And the Office of the Provost will be hosting Dr. Anthony Jack, author of The Privileged Poor, on February 11th. And then you can join or host an Emory Civic Dinner, an opportunity to unite the Emory community through conversation, dialogue, and the goal of an inspiring action through civicdinners.com/Emory to learn more. And you can also check your email on the Emory Collective at emorycollective.com to register, hear about more, look at upcoming events with the university and the Alumni Association. So with that, the Emory, DC, and San Francisco Bay Area networks, we thank you for that. Again, I'll thank the president of the DC Policy and Politics Network, Adriana, and the rest of the team there. We're excited for 2021. Nicole and Tony for pulling this together with the San Francisco Bay Area Network, and all the staff support who are behind the scenes, and the Alumni Association for partnering on this event. Thank you to the faculty partners and leading their insights, and Gonzalo for leading his insights and expertise. And I'm glad we were able to go there. So thank you for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you, Gonzalo.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.